Now that war has pretty much just gone full scale in Europe, President Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, who we talked about during the Progressive era, he is going to basically announce that the United States is going to remain neutral. We had pretty much committed to this isolationist attitude, and most people agreed that there was no point in joining a war that was 3,000 miles away. So it didn't really seem to threaten any kind of American lives or property. Um, but it didn't mean that individuals were going to be indifferent to what happened in Europe because you have to think about, we talked about about a month ago now, about the increase in immigration. There are a lot of Europeans that are living in the United States now, and a lot of Germans, a lot of Italians, a lot of Irish, a lot of different groups. So they're still going to have some ties to things back home. And so we have some different groups that are going to believe different things about World War I. So your socialists, they criticize the war as more of a capitalist and imperial struggle between superpowers. And a lot of, American families don't want their sons to get involved in something that they don't really see a point in, really an ultimate point. Like, why are we fighting something that's 3,000 miles away kind of situation? And then your naturalized citizens are really going to follow the war closely because they still have ties to other countries. A lot of Germans really are keeping close tabs on what's happening over in Europe. And then, we have our sympathies with Great Britain because of our common ancestry and just language and very similar democratic institutions. So, as Germany's aggressive movements through Belgium increased, American sympathy increased for the Allies. And as Germans, they attacked different civilian businesses and civilian places, you see more American propaganda against German, like what the Germans were doing. And all of this mentality of keeping the neutrality up is going to become really difficult for a lot of American businesses because we had traded with both countries or all of these countries for so long. But as the war continues, then we realize that our trade is going to really drop off with Germany. So there's a chart in your book that shows how that dropped off. But what you see is Great Britain in blue, and you can see that as the war years go, your trade output is going to increase by a lot with Great Britain. France increases, and then other European countries. But Germany is in green, and it drops off substantially, it is almost practically to nothing by 1917. So, all right, coming back to this. So, the majority of Americans are going to favor victory for the Allies rather than the Central Powers, but they did not want to join the Allies' fight. But by 1917, America had mobilized for war against the Central Powers in order to ensure that the Allies, who had been loaned, $2.3 billion, that, we want to make sure that we get that money back. And we're also going to prevent the Germans from threatening U.S. shipping because we're still trading with Great Britain. So we want to make sure that everything is arriving in Great Britain. So the fighting on land continues, but Britain's going to use its superior naval strength to set up a blockade of the German coast to make sure that no weapons, military supplies, and really even food is going to get to that country. And that extends to these neutral ports along the coast, and that prevents, a a lot of goods from reaching them. So American ships that are bringing food to Germany, they're not going to want to challenge the blockade that's been put up. And so Germany is going to find it increasingly difficult to import food and fertilizer to make their own food. And so what you end up seeing is actually by 1917, there's going to be a widespread famine in Germany. And about 750,000 people are going to die or starve to death as a result of the British blockade. And this actually does make Americans angry because it's kind of, I mean, I get it. You could say all's fair in love and war, but it's just like a human rights violation almost. So Germany has to come up with a way to respond, and that's what we'll see next. Their counter to the blockade that Great Britain was putting up is their U-boats. And they're going to put out a message that any British or Allied ship found in waters around Britain is going to be sunk. And it's not always possible to warn crews that are traveling on these ships. One of the worst disasters is the sinking of the Lusitania in May of 1915. There are over 1,000 people that are lost from the sinking of the Lusitania, and 128 of those people are Americans. Germany's going to sit back and say, you know, this liner, it carried ammunitions, and we couldn't have that, you know, coming into Great Britain. So despite all of that, Americans are still going to be outraged because there was loss of American life. And so this is, you know, the beginning of the turn of American public opinion against Germany and the Central Powers. So President Wilson is going to rule out a military response in favor of protest of Germany. But 3 months later, a U-boat sank another British liner, the Arabic, which killed 2 Americans. And then even after protest, the German people or the German army agreed not to sink any more passenger ships. But in March of 1916, they broke their promise when they torpedoed a French passenger steamer, the Sussex. It had about 80 passengers, and some were Americans, and they're killed or injured. After this last attack, Wilson's going to threaten to end diplomatic relations with Germany altogether. And they're going to fear that, you know, they, being Germany, is going to fear that this is going to cause the United States to enter the war, and they can't really handle another person or another country in that fight. So they pledged that they will not sink any more merchant vessels without warning and without saving human lives. But they had their own condition. That was, if the United States cannot persuade Britain to lift its blockade against food and fertilizers, then they would be renewing their counter blockade. So you come back to the United States, our homeland, and we're in 1916. And this is the next presidential election. So Wilson's up for re-election for his second term, and then the Republicans are going to nominate the Supreme Court Justice Charles Evans Hughes for the opponent. And Wilson's going to run on the idea that, you know, he kept us out of the war, and it's kind of the idea that it's going to stay that way. And Wilson's going to win that. It's a really close election, but Wilson ultimately comes out the winner of that election. His main effort is a peace. He wants to basically have a ceasefire between the European countries. He calls for peace without victory. So the Allies, they're not too happy about this. They blame the Central Powers for starting the war in the first place, and they wanted them to pay for all of the damage and destruction that had been done to their countries. And so they ignore his call for peace. Germany is going to hope to defeat Britain by, they're going to start their unrestricted submarine warfare again. And on January 30th of 1916, the Kaiser is going to announce that the U-boats would sink all ships in British waters, hostile or neutral, on sight. And this stuns Wilson. He's calling this an overt act of war. And he's waiting for that moment that if they attack one of our ships or if there's some other overt act against the United States, then we will declare war. And he gets that overt act with the Zimmermann Note. The Zimmermann Note is a secret telegram from the German foreign minister to the German ambassador in Mexico. It's intercepted and decoded by British agents. And the telegram proposed an alliance between Mexico and Germany and then promised if war broke out with the United States, Germany would help Mexico in their recovery of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. They hoped that an American war with Mexico would keep the United States out of the war in Europe. So little pieces of this telegram were printed in newspapers in the United States, and the Americans are upset about this. And on top of the Zimmermann Note, the Germans are going to sink another unarmed American merchant ship, and with more lives lost, it's only a matter of time before we enter the war on the side of the Allies.